So, well, you wanted you put the lights down, didn't you?
Yeah, it's just as long as people can
Like
see the
that.
screen. That's
Oh, that's
better,
good.
isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming out on such a horrible night. Really appreciate you coming along, and also the fact that it's a slightly unusual slot for this. In week 10 of the autumn term, but also at 5 o'clock, not the usual 5:30 start. So for all of those reasons, it's great to see you here. And it's a really great pleasure to invite and to welcome Hilary Orange to yours and to talk to you this evening. As you know, this should have been a double bill with Paul Graves-Brown, and I suspect Paul is with us actually, down on the other end of the line here. But he wasn't able to travel up from South Wales, unfortunately. So we do have Hilary presenting this talk on behalf of both of them, and it has been a collaborative,
yes,
very much a collaborative project. So it's very much a joint presentation which Hilary is going to deliver. So Hilary is currently has honorary research status at UCL. She's also been at Humboldt recently as well, and it's also worth noting that she is the prizes and grants officer for the Society for Post-Medieval Archaeology as well. So we come across Hilary in that capacity as well with our undergraduate and master's students and the dissertation prizes and so on. So in a number of ways we have a connection with Hilary here in the department, and I supervised Hilary's PhD back in the day as well. Although
yes.
I was your external supervisor, really, wasn't I, when I was at English Heritage. So it's really nice to welcome Hilary up here and to hear about what I know is a really exciting project. So Hilary, I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to hand over to you to tell us about Sites and Music Pilgrimage in London. Hilary.
Thanks, John, and thanks very much for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I talk quite quietly in normal life, so if you can't hear me at any point, just kind of wave at me. Just sort of do that, and that'll be a signal that I need to raise my voice a little bit, as I do have a quiet voice. So without any further ado, so as John said, this is a project that myself and Paul have been doing since 2016, and that date is significant. I'll just get going. So about the project. So what we're doing is we're doing a longitudinal study of the development of rock and pop shrines in London. And we're hoping that this study will tell us about public mourning and commemoration in relation to celebrity musicians. And we're focusing on what's called grassroots memorials or spontaneous shrines, and also the tribute materials that make up those shrines in relation to a number of artists. David Bowie, but also Marc Bolan, Amy Winehouse, Freddie Mercury, and George Michael. And so the things that we're doing specifically are we're looking at the location, the kind of why are these things located where they are, mainly in streets, but not always in streets. And we're also looking at how these sites evolve, so we keep returning to them again and again to look at how they've changed. And we're looking at so-called official responses and attitudes to shrines. And we're also looking at the collection and curation of tribute materials by a number of London archives and museums, and following that process through. And we're hoping to unpick the relationships between the fan, the celebrity musician, who's actually dead but still has a post-life, the tribute materials, and look at the meanings, the actions and performances contained within the development and evolution of these shrine sites. And we are entirely self-funded. We do this on holidays and high days, essentially when we can take the train into London and when we have time. But because it's a longitudinal study, we feel we have the time to just keep on doing this project until we get fed up or we think we find the answers to these questions. So the way this talk's going to be structured is I'm going to talk about how it began. I'm going to look at some earlier historic examples of public commemoration. And then I'm going to focus on London and look at, first of all, the Bowie shrines, then the other shrines, and then shrines that once were in the London landscape but disappeared. And then look at collection, curation, and display. I can say something about different types of shrines. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of thematic experts. Would somebody come through the door? Do I need to come in? Come in. Don't wait out there. Come in. That's okay. No problem. Yeah, there's certain thematic aspects we've been talking about and thinking about. One of them is what do these shrines tell us about kind of religious, are they religious, or is it some kind of para-religious activity, or is it a secular activity? And that's kind of it. And then hopefully there'll be questions, and hopefully there'll be questions that I will know the answers to. So how this began, I'm going to have to pretend to be Paul now, because Paul's told me this story, so it's a bit of a close memory. Apparently, it began actually a conversation between Paul and John at English Heritage. So you'll have to confirm this or deny it. At Savile Row, the old English Heritage site, when Paul was visiting you, and apparently you mentioned this. Do you remember? I don't know if you remember this conversation.
I don't remember.
You don't remember.
I'm sure it's possible.
But yeah, apparently this conversation between, I don't know when, between Paul and John back in London at the Old English Heritage Site in Savile Row. And John mentioned that this is the album cover of Ziggy Stardust, which hopefully some of you own. And the phone box where David Bowie is posing, the original phone box isn't there anymore, but another phone box is. And so this is what led Paul down to Hedden Street, which is just off Regent Street. And that's apparently what led Paul into kind of doing quite a lot of research on music heritage over the years. So as you probably know, Paul's done some research with John on the Sex Pistols, which I'm sure you've heard about. And Paul has also has an article in this Red publication, which is well worth a look if you have it in your library. Basically a kind of a tour around London sites and music heritage. And this is quite interesting. So this is Time Out magazine from October 1984. And there it says, Ziggy Stardust stood here in Hedden Street, being photographed by the photographer Brian Ward, who had a studio there. That's the only reason why the photo shoot took place there. And it's calling it a rock landmark. So again, I'm borrowing from Paul's research here. We think that through the Ziggy Stardust album, that phone box in this location was already been a site of pilgrimage in the 1970s, probably quite soon after the album cover came out. There's a couple of images in Paul's article that show graffiti that was there in the phone box before David Bowie died. So that's one of the points we want to make. These pilgrimage sites, these acts of commemoration were often taking place during the artist's lifetime. So bear that in mind. So go through the doc. And the other thing in Hedden Street, again to mark the album, is a plaque that was erected in 2012, just around the corner. It's, if you go back and look at the album cover, it's kind of where the K West sign is. And what's interesting about this is it's not a plaque to David Bowie. He's not actually David Bowie. He was born David Robert Jones. So Ziggy Stardust and David Bowie were both personas and characters. But it's one of the few examples of plaques to people who never actually existed. And so this is the second site that attracts kind of memorial actions, if you like, on the same. It's quite a tiny street, it's just full of restaurants and bars now. And then, of course, in 2016, David Bowie died of liver cancer at the age of 69. And I've been well, I won't say lifelong, so I wasn't a fan when I was a baby, but certainly from the age of 10, 11, I was a huge fan of David Bowie. I had the posters on the walls, I listened to records, I hitchhiked with a friend to Wembley to see him in concert. And Paul knew this, and so at that point, Paul said to me, well, how about we look at what's going on in London, because it was being reported so much in the press, and we were seeing these video clips and images of all kinds of fan activity and memorialisation. I didn't hesitate for a second, it was just a straightforward yes. And so I think for both of us, it's also a labour of love, this project. So that's an image actually from just, I think, a few days after Bowie passed away. I went down to Heaven Street one night and was really quite surprised and overwhelmed and really quite touched by what I saw there. So as you see, the usual kind of tribute materials, flowers, teddy bears, but also things that are very personal to fans. But I'll talk a bit more about the actual materials and the artefacts later on in the talk. So what I want to do is I want to kind of situate what we're doing within a historical context, if you like. And so I want to talk about some other and earlier examples, some notable examples of public grief and commemoration, things that you already know about. So the touchstone that we read about very often in other articles of academics' work on this subject is this, of course. Sea of flowers outside Buckingham Palace when Princess Diana died on the 31st of August 1997 in a car accident in Paris. So I checked some statistics on this, and according to one newspaper, 15 tons of bouquets and 16 million individual flowers. And in places, some of it was kind of 2 foot deep. And I think that this event, Princess Di dying, is seen in some way as kind of triggering an increase in this kind of activity, this kind of shrine activity. There are some possibilities that kind of the sort of creation of these spontaneous shrines has actually accelerated since his date. I'm not sure that that's actually true, because there are other earlier examples. So would anybody like to guess who the dead artist is here? It's a musician, it's American.
Oh, was it Elvis?
Elvis. Yeah. This is a scene outside the funeral home in Memphis, of course, when Elvis Presley died. Also, unexpectedly, also at quite a young age, in the summer of 11. And I've just finished reading 2 really weighty biographies about Elvis. And there's a section in it that just talks about flowers. The fact that it wasn't just the Memphis flower sellers that sold out, it was really across the region. They couldn't keep up with demand. And the family said that the fans could actually take the flowers away. Within a few hours, all of the flowers were apparently removed. But when people talk about Princess Di and the flower revolution, the sea of flowers, I think, well, there are other examples of this, and this is one of them. Now, I was lucky enough to visit Graceland in January this year. No, what year are we in? 2018, yes, January. And with Paul, we both went because we were over there for the SHA conference. So we flew up to Memphis, we couldn't really not go. And there you have the Graceland mansion in the background. You notice this wall running along? That wall is for decades been covered in fan graffiti. So it's a little bit analogous to the kind of David Bowie phone box that reading the biography about Elvis, there were always fans outside the doors of Graceland. Elvis used to regularly go down and talk to the fans. And I don't know exactly when this graffiti started, but it's certainly been a kind of an aspect of pilgrimage in Memphis for probably 30 years, if not more, 40 years. And so that's the kind of thing that you see, this kind of layering of graffiti as you peer over the wall. So, also in America, who do you think's died here? It's not a musician, it's a very famous actor, screen idol. I'll give you a clue. It's very hot summer, August of 1926. Any guesses?
Charlie Chaplin.
No.
Yes.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yes, well done, Valentino. Yeah, Rudolph Valentino. So he died very suddenly of pleurisy, completely unexpected. He was a megastar at the time. And reading about newspaper reports, it was a situation practically of hysteria. There were reports of fans committing suicide. And this is actually outside the funeral church. And this kind of, they have statistics of 100,000 people descending on the area at the time. So this just gives you a little view of the crowd. And because of a number of people that wanted to get in to see the body, to take part, apparently riots erupted in New York. It was really quite serious and the police were called in. And then this is another one. This is Paris, to give you a clue. You can probably read the name there. James Douglas Morrison, so Jim Morrison. And this is another instance of memorialization and pilgrimage that's often talked about, because there are various things that keep on happening at this site around this grave that have actually caused some contention between the people that manage the site and the fans. So over the years, there's been a number of a bust and a grave marker that have actually been stolen. And there's also been reports of things that fans that have been left, things that have been left by fans, then being removed by fans. And I think that's actually quite common. I'm sure that also happens at the sites in London with Bowie shrines, and particularly kind of high value objects that are left. I'm sure they're actually removed by other people. So there is quite a lot of work that's been done on spontaneous shrines and pilgrimage already. We're following in the footsteps of some great books and articles. So just to run through some ideas to bear in mind as I talk about the various sites that we've been exploring. The term spontaneous shrine was coined by the folklorist Jack Santino. Temporary memorials that people construct their own motivation to mark the sites of untimely deaths. So think about high school shootings, acts of terror. You've probably seen them all on the news. They can also lead to the creation of spontaneous shrines. Sometimes they're also called grassroots memorials. Why do people do this? There's a theory that it's a way of working one's way through grief, a kind of healing, self-help by the act of actually taking part in a pilgrimage, by going to the site. People often leave things about themselves at these places. Yes, you'll get the image of the artist, but you'll also get people's names, their dates of birth, their phone numbers, their photographs, their stories. The fans are very much embedded in their own images, and their own stories are actually embedded in these places as much as the artist is. Gary Vicken has talked about pilgrimage, and to quote Yuri, a well-known idea that tourists gaze at places. He said that unlike the tourist who goes to places mostly to see, the pilgrim has this more tactile, physical, spiritual relationship to the site. Again, often taking things to the place. And so we've been thinking about other precedents to this. Paul's been looking at war memorials, and the laying of flowers at war memorials, and the idea of that people often touch the names of the deceased on war memorials. And again, it comes back to this kind of idea of physicality. Matt Hills has done some great work in fan studies around the fact that, I say facts, I believe he's true, that taking part in this kind of raises your fan cultural capital, if that makes sense. And so Alderman has written about Graceland and about the Graceland Wall, and he's argued, quite successfully I believe, that fans are both the author and the agent of a celebrity's memory. They're really keeping the celebrity's memory alive. There's much more I could talk about, but we don't have time. So on to David Bowie, who was born David Robert Jones. So there are 3 main sites of pilgrimage in London connected with David Bowie. Sorry. Oh no, that's all right, come in. Yes, so the first one I've already mentioned, which is Hemel Street. So if you're ever down near Piccadilly, do wander up and take a look. Has anybody actually been to Hemel Street to see the phone box? Okay, go. It's really close to Piccadilly. It's literally about a 5-minute walk. It's easy to get there. And so there's the phone box, not the original phone box that was on the album cover, another phone box. And these photographs probably date to 2016 or 17. Subsequently, the wall, the brick wall has been painted over and some of the graffiti has been removed, but it just appears again. And these are the kind of high value objects which will probably be removed by the fans, I imagine. And because of the prevalence of mobile phone technology, I actually see this as a 3-dimensional tribute space. I really doubt that anybody makes phone calls in this box. If they do, they might try to phone David Bowie's whole number, if anybody knows it, which I thought would be really neat. But the inside of the box is also full of tribute material and graffiti. So there you go. That's just the inside of the box. Quite difficult to photograph because it's so red. And then round the corner, as I've already mentioned, is the second memorial site, which is underneath the Zig Zag plaque. So Hedon Street is basically majority owned and managed by the Crown Estate. And the street, well, back in the day when Brian Ward was photographing David Bowie, it looks more kind of run down. There's cars parked. It's now mainly pedestrianised, and it's now a row of fairly smart restaurants. So I'm not quite sure how the restaurant holders feel about the fact that there's always kind of decaying floor material right next to their diners. The last time I visited, the Crown Estate had actually put a cycle stand kind of in the middle of where the flowers are in the picture, and I wonder whether they've done that to kind of deter future material laying. I kind of like the fact that often when I go to these sites, in a sense, they remind me of a grave, because the wall becomes the headstone and then the flowers become the actual grave, if that makes sense. And I think it's important to think about what happened with David Bowie's body, because he died in New York and he was cremated, and nobody really knows what happened to his ashes. It's obviously the family's business. And there isn't a grave that fans can visit. So in the absence of a grave, what fans do is they find ulterior locations. And something like the plaque and the phone box is going to be an attractor for its symbolic value. And the fact that that is to Ziggy, who never really existed. It's also made us look at Melissa Beattie's work on Yanto Jones from Torchwood. I'm a big Torchwood fan. So I've never actually seen Torchwood, so these are Paul's photographs, so I might be about to make an error. I think this is Cardiff.
Yeah.
Cardiff. I was about to say Swansea. So this is in Cardiff, and this is a shrine to, I guess he died in Torchwood. I'm just guessing here.
He died in London.
Oh, he died in London. Okay. So Melissa we've been in touch with Melissa over the years. She's been great. She's been kind of telling us about various things we should read and think about. And so Melissa has a chapter on this shrine site in John's book, Who Needs Experts? So there are other examples of memorials to people that never existed. Another one that Paul's visited in London is the one to do with Sherlock Holmes when he jumped off a roof of Reichenbach's Fall. Reichenbach's Fall, yeah. There's all kinds of things now happening around that, which is even more bizarre because he didn't actually really die, did he? He just kind of faked it. So, people are crazy, really. And it kind of comes down to, well, who is Bowie really? So which Bowie do you want to pick for your memorialisation? Do you want to pick a Aladdin Sane Bowie or a Even Bowie or a Ziggy Bowie? So Bowie is on record as saying that he saw himself as an actor. So when fans are doing these things, and when I myself go to these sites and I think about my relationship with Bowie, I never actually knew him. I saw him once in the flesh. But I try to remember that there's a real family there that's still grieving, So it's interesting that people feel compelled to actually sometimes spend a lot of money as well and time on these pilgrimages and acts of memorial for somebody they essentially never really knew or only knew as a persona. I do love him though. So the second Bowie site is actually in Brixton, and that's because that's where David Bowie was born. So he was a South London boy. And the actual memorial, let me just mention, so after he died, this was a scene outside the Ritzy cinema. And I don't know if you can read that, it says David Bowie, our Brixton boy. And there's video clips online of crowds of people singing. They all just spontaneously came out together to sing, to honour him when they heard the news. But the memorial isn't actually here, it's quite close by. It's on a pedestrian street called Tunstall Road, which is right opposite the underground station. So if you come out the underground and just go across the zebra crossing, you're there. And this is a mural that's painted by an Australian street artist called Jimmy C. In 2013, I think. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 2013. It's on the side of a department store, Morley's department store. And what you can't see in the photo is you see the red brick wall going off into the distance that way. There's graffiti the entire length of that wall. And some, I think, even around the corner. Some of it's quite high up. And you notice that there's graffiti appearing on the actual red part of the mural. And so this was just after his death. Flowers were really quite kind of deep. And so that had already been there for 3 years before he died, 2-3 years. And what happens to things when they're left? Well, obviously a lot of it's perishable, so it starts to decay. Not all of it, but a lot of it, because a lot of it is organic. And so I contacted some of the London waste authorities and I kind of said, what happens? What kind of do you do about this? And what they actually do at this site is the waste collection teams go down, they kind of separate out the recent stuff from this not so recent stuff. But essentially this all gets bagged up like any other street rubbish and it ends up floating down the Thames on a barge to the waste to energy incineration plant. But they do think about it and they do take it into consideration and they do separate out the old from the new flowers from the old. But really it has to be removed, otherwise it's just going to attract vermin and all kinds of problems. So there's a street cleaner in action. One day. And because of the amount of graffiti, by the following year, I think, Morley's had put up signs saying, "We politely request that you keep your messages and dedications to the edges of the mural and not on David, as on his face, so that this beautiful mural can be enjoyed by everyone for years to come. Thank you. And of course, what do people do? They graffiti on the sign, naturally. And the last time we went, there was this big frame and protective screen over it. And the vase for the flowers, I thought was quite cute. I mean, Morley's have been great about looking after this site. It's been repainted, and as you'll see on the white pillar, the graffiti's been removed completely. But they are taking care about it, and they do seem to care about it. But even still, the stickers appearing on the frame, and there's graffiti on the frame, people do still try. They will find a way around it. Whatever they do, they'll find a way to kind of decorate it with their own words and thoughts and feelings. One thing that was supposed to happen but didn't, there was this idea new to create the Zig Zag Sculpture on Tunstall Road, which was going to be a crowdfunding campaign, but they never raised the money. I think they needed 900,000, and that never happened. At the moment, there isn't actually a David Bowie statue in London. There are kind of statues in. There's a plaque in Maidstone, and there's also a statue in Aylesbury, where Ziggy played with the Spiders from Mars. There isn't one in London yet. I'm sure that will happen in due course. And I popped into Morley's because I wanted to use the loo. And I'm quite glad I did, because I didn't realise that on the third floor, they're now actually merchandising the mural. So you can go and see the mural, lay flowers, and then you can pop in, use a loo, and buy your own kind of mural cushion if you want to. I think it doesn't really have that much of a direct connection to David Bowie's life. I mean, he didn't really do anything at Tunstall Road. It's just because he was born in that area. But the house where he was born, Stansfield Road, isn't too far away. And we visited there the same time that we went to the mural for the first time. When we first walked past, we thought there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing here. And then the second time we walked past, we realised there was something. There was the top of a grave candle. I used to see these all the time in Germany. I don't see them so often here. But there didn't seem to be any activity at all around the house, which is obviously privately owned, and the owners may not want there to be tributes left. And then the third major site is actually in Beckenham. This is where Bowie lived when he kind of rose to fame. And he lived in a house. There's a very exotic villa, kind of, it's just off the map, that's up the A2015. But the actual tribute site is actually the Croydon Rec Ground park down at the bottom. And the reason why that's significant has a direct connection to David Bowie's life and career, because it's to do with this. It's to do with the Bowie Bandstand, as it's now being called. So the story here is connected to a festival that Bowie was instrumental in organising in August 1969, and it was called the Free Festival. So Bowie at the time was involved in the Beckenham Arts Lab, which is like a folk arts group in a pub that used to be called Three Tons. And so he was, he wasn't properly famous at this point, but fairly soon afterwards he was, when he was living in Beckenham. So him and his friends kind of organised this street festival this summer, and there are photographs of him playing in the bandstand. And you may know the song "Memory of a Free Festival." which is basically a song that he recorded afterwards about this particular event. And so every time we visit, there's lots of things happening at this site. There's always tributes, there's always flowers, there are always notes. And it feels to me like the people who visit this site kind of really know something about David Bowie's life. They're either local or they're quite well up on his life and they realise that there's a Beckham connection. Whereas at Tunstall Road, I sometimes think that people just come out of the train and then they kind of discover this mural perhaps. So there's a photograph of him playing in some bandstand. And then every summer, because they're trying to restore this bandstand, there's a Bowie festival where they have tribute acts and stalls and all kinds of things. And they're trying to raise money to repair the Edwardian bandstand. And at the Three Tons pub, which is now an Italian restaurant, there's also a plaque. There's a dead flower. I mean, I think they've just forgotten to clean it up because there were flowers outside after he died, but there really isn't much there when we visit subsequently. So again, to try to put this into context, so I have a database where I'm trying to collect global examples of shrines and tributes to musicians, which I'll probably never finish because there are so many. But just on Bowie alone, I've got 28 sites around the world. Stars have been named after him, as in Stars in the Sky. Postage stamps, street shrines in Berlin, in New York, murals, graffiti are very, very common, statues and parks. And again, some of this dates to before he died. And I also wanted to flag up that things could still be happening 30 years in the future. Because there are examples, for example, Robert Johnson, the Mississippi bluesman, where a grave marker is erected for him 15 years after his death. So we could be, I won't be alive, but in 50 years' time, somebody could be giving this talk and talking about new memorials to David Bowie as possible. So moving on now to other musical sites in London. How am I doing for time?
It is 20 to 6. So we can go for about 35
Okay,
minutes.
I'll speed up then. So Marc Bolan, born Mark Feld, from T-Rex. The main site for him is in South London, in Barnes. Now he was killed in a car crash at quite a young age, at 29. And the site where he was killed has also been a very long-standing memorial site. It's a really complex site. It's a really interesting one and worth visiting. So there are 2 permanent memorial stones. There's a notice board. What happened was the car actually hit the railing, and then the railing hit the tree. In the early press reports, the tree was actually blamed for his death, but actually the tree saved the life of the person that was driving the car, which was Gloria Jones, his girlfriend. And so over the years, people have vandalised and attacked the tree. And the tree's gone, unfortunately. And the barrel is actually on top of the tree stump. And this site is managed, it's on a perpetuity lease to the T-Rex Action Group. They have a website, and they basically look after this site. So I'm just going to whisk through some photographs to show you what it looks like. So there's things like guitar picks, dinosaurs, because T-Rex was Tyrannosaurus Rex. Lots of photographs of Marc. He was reputed to be a very beautiful man. So there you go, lots of images of Marc. And I love a little blue notice, sort of conditions of entry, what you can and can't do on this site when you visit. And and that's the T-Rex Action Group website. We've also looked at Amy Winehouse, who's the only person we've looked at who actually kept her original name. Who's born in North London. And the sites to Amy are basically in Camden. It's a place that she's very well known to be associated with. It's where she lived when she died. And there are two sites. The first one is outside the house where she lived and died, and there's a row of London trees, and these have become tree shrines. After she died, I think there were flowers covering the entire front of the house and parked cars even, but those have been cleared out of the way. At some point, tree matting went on the trees to protect the trees, because you can see where the bark has been taken from the trees as souvenirs. So what people do is they push things into the gaps. And I've seen cigarette packets, alcohol, business cards, notes. I got chatting to a guy who lives nearby, and he told me that he finds hypodermic needles as well pushed in. There's a note to Amy, I love you. And then the second thing in Camden for Amy is a statue, which is in the Stables Market, Camden Market. So it's a permanent statue. It's made for the selfie generation, because you're supposed to link arms with her, have your photograph taken. The managers of the market say that they will not allow this to become a shrine. Originally, there was an idea that it was going to be placed out in a public square, but they were concerned about activity around it at night. So the reason it's in the market is that because the market's closed at night, and so it's not going to get antisocial behaviour, also called antisocial behaviour. People dressed it with friendship bracelets. And then there's been a lot of graffiti in Camden as well, because there was a street trail of Amy Winehouse graffiti in connection with a museum about her life, an exhibition about her life at the Jewish Museum in 2013. So some of this graffiti still exists and some of it's been painted over. And then there are shrines that have gone. So the ones that have disappeared are mainly for Freddie Mercury and George Michael. So the Freddie Mercury one was at his former home in Logan Place in Court and Garden Lodge. This was the scene in 2016 when we visited, and all of it's been taken away. There were plexiglass screens over it, but they've been removed. And the house has been in possession of his long-term friend and once girlfriend, Mary Austin. And it was her decision to basically remove the graffiti. There were reports in the press, let me just find my notes about it. Yeah, it was all removed in 2017, apparently due to pressure from neighbours. Now, the other lost things to Freddie are a little bit complicated. The things on this side still exist, and the things on that side don't. These are all in Feltham, which is where the family moved to when he was a boy. They moved from Zanzibar to Feltham. And so the plaque is at the former home. And then the pentagram was in the shopping centre, in the town centre. And that got weathered and people started nicking bits of mosaic. So that went. And then the small star replaced the pentagon, and that still exists. And then this one is quite interesting. I'm just going to read my notes here. So Freddie was cremated at Kensal Green Cemetery And there's been speculation about the location of his ashes. And that plaque, written in French, pour être toujours, appeared in 2013. So Freddie's birth name was Farouk Bulsara. And then people cottoned on to the fact that this might be marking the place where the ashes were left. And by the end of the year, it had been removed. So it's really pretty clear that family, perhaps Mary, really don't want any kind of tribute activity around these sites. They just want to keep it private. And then the other one that's disappeared is the shrine to George Michael. This is outside his former home in Highgate. There was a really large garden park shrine to him. And what you had there were these kind of individual plots where fans were saying, this is my plot. And then the next fan was, and that's mine, a bit like a car boot sale. I'm not trying to be rude, but it did remind me of that. And it was beautifully looked after. They even had gardening toolboxes and I don't know if I put a photo in. They were really clearly demarcated. It was completely unlike any other of the shrines I've seen. What do you call fake grass? AstroTurf, that kind of thing. And the water butt, I loved the water butt. So the people who were kind of taking charge of this thought, okay, we're gardeners. This is George's garden. And if it's a garden, then we need a water butt to look after the flowers that were growing here. So you really did get a sense of a lot of love at this site. It was bursting with hearts and love. But now it's gone. This photograph was literally a few weeks later. And again, according to press reports, signs up saying, please don't go in, we're growing the grass, thank you. Again, it was to do with pressure from neighbours. People objecting to the mess, objecting to the dirt, it wasn't clean. We kind of wonder whether this is really to do with the mess or to do with the people. Kind of concepts of purity and things that shouldn't be in place, things that are in place. Because this idea of kind of mess keeps on cropping up again and again. So whether things appear again is going to be interesting. The people that cleared the site out did miss some stuff. They missed some things hanging in trees, and there's things like cable ties and glitter on the grass. So if you're an archaeologist, you can still spot a few traces, if you like, but the majority of it's gone. So that's my whistle-stop tour through London sites to musical heritage. So one thing we're looking at is the evolution and development of these sites and the places that remain and evolve, remain kind of spontaneous, as in created by fans and the public, and things that become more official over time. But they're not really truly spontaneous. If they were, things would just be popping up on the pavement in front of you as you went walking down Oxford Street. All of these sites have kind of location and access matters. I mean, what I say about that, I mean, is that their place and access to them matters. There has to be public access. It has to be like a site of agora where people can essentially congregate and worship. There also has to be some kind of either vertical or horizontal system for you to hang your tributes on. Feeder stations work really well, trees work really well, phone boxes work really well, walls, floors. They can't be too close to roads because the highways will just move in and clear them, because the highways can't really enable, drivers' sightlines to be affected. And so there are reasons why things occur in certain places. But generally speaking, what we found is that the sites relate predominantly to the artist's life and biography, which makes sense, doesn't it? So it's either birthplace, home, site of death, a grave or a place of performance. And then the second category is a symbolic site. It may be really tangential, like Tunstall Road, but Tunstall Road is almost like the perfect shrine site because it's pedestrianised, it's right near the main railway station. It has a sympathetic owner-manager in Wallace department store who are in a sense starting to commercialise the shrine. But it's a secondary artwork. So in a way, it's acting as a cenotaph, it's acting as a kind of symbolic locus for remembering his life and work. And then you also get sites that are associated with song lyrics. So Abbey Road is a good example, or Strawberry Fields, or also the Bowie bandstand is both biographical and associated with song lyrics. And some of this material has been collected by London Archives and Museums. This is us, or that's Paul rather, at the V&A, looking through material that they were donated by the Crown Estate. Talking to the archivists, last time we talked to them, they weren't really sure what to do with it. It's been in their freezer. I mean, some of it, it's been left in the street, it's been rained on, it's been trodden on, it's dirty. So there's kind of environmental issues around some material. And there's also ethical issues. Even though a lot of it's going to be collected and taken down on a barge to be incinerated, the museums are conscious that this could be sacred material for some people. And so they're also trying to work through the thinking about whether they should be collecting this material and how and why should they collect it and how it could be displayed. And so these are some of the things in the archive now at V&A. And then we've also visited, Bromley have an archive. And we also visited them. They're a bit further along. They actually have some of this material on display now. But it's all fairly generic. I mean, the material in the V&A and the Bromley collection isn't really that different. So this is a display they now have on Bowie in the Central Library in Bromley. And they have some of these little kind of memorial cards and other things from their tribute collection. Which leads on to the question of how religious is this? There's questions around Elvis. During his life, he had a godlike status. The cult that's kind of developed around his death. We've seen material to Bowie where people seem to be leaving messages saying how much he changed their life. So I've got a quote here somewhere. You gave me inspiration to pursue what I wanted in life rather than what I was told I should want. Thank you. The note ended. Those are the kind of messages that we've seen. So we kind of wondered, we have an article that's been published where we kind of questioned whether, like Elvis, David Bowie will over time sort of reach a position of apotheosis. Will he also become godlike? Will he also become saintly? Are these fan behaviours and activities a form of religion? Are they related to religion? Or are they a secular form of respect? I don't have any answers to that at the moment, but it's just an interesting question. And we've also seen things like this, sealed envelopes to Ziggy in the archive. We've talked to other museums around the world. I've been in touch with the 9/11 Museum and with the museum to do with the earthquake, 2010 earthquake in Canterbury, New Zealand. And they also have sealed envelopes. It's quite common for people to leave these sealed messages. And so those are some of the sort of examples of people who are, some of it almost comes across as a form of intercession where people are saying, you know, well, thank you for setting us all free. The stars are different tonight. And that's it. Thank you very much. I should say before I finish is the next phase of our work is going to be to do some ethnography where we're actually going to interview some of the stakeholders and obviously hopefully talk to the fans and find out more about their tribute choice and tribute behaviours. So that's going to start probably around the anniversaries, because the anniversaries are obviously events at which this kind of whole process starts again.
Hilary, thank you very much. Fascinating stuff. And although I'd read a little bit about it, it was really good to hear the sort of the background to it and a much fuller account of where this work is, where it's been and where it's headed. So really interesting stuff. And Paul, if you're there, it's a really great project, and we look forward to hearing a lot more about how it develops over the next few years. But for now, we've got time for some questions or comments from anybody here. I don't know if we take questions online as well, but certainly from those in the room. Yes.
Yeah, really interesting. What's particularly intrigued me, and you covered it a little bit at the end, was this difference between a secular interpretation and religious. You actually peppered your presentation with words like shrines and memorial, etc., which sort of gives the impression that's how everybody interacts with these occasions, and also the collection in the V&A, where you again view this sort of relationship with some of the tributes that have been left. Tributes, again, there's another word, which you're giving interpretation to, which actually people maybe didn't have that interpretation, but you're interpreting it for them. And you said you didn't have the answer to whether it's secular or religious. Is it not that?
It could be both.
It could be both and everything to people.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it does mean something to people to visit these sites, but also what it means for some people is different to others, and it is a transient thing. Oh, we'll go there, or as you say, you walk out and it's there, we visit, etc. So I mean, I think it's a really confusing message that comes from it, what they actually mean and what the value of something like this, and the interpretation of the value.
I mean, people have done some work on it around some of the sites of tragedy, but obviously, I mean, even though I was a David Bowie fan, I can't feel that him dying at 69 was, yes, it was sad, but he really could have died in Berlin at a much younger age. I mean, it's quite amazing that, he didn't die at a younger age, whereas I feel worse when I go and see Amy Winehouse because she died at 27, So I don't know also how that may affect people's relationships to these sites, but I think you're absolutely right. The reason why I'm sitting on the fence is because we haven't done the ethnographic work yet. And I don't feel like I'm using terms like spontaneous shrine because those are the terms that are riddled into the academic literature. So something, and things like grassroots memorials, but I'm sure that lots of people who go and do this stuff don't know the term spontaneous shrine. They may think of them as a shrine. But yes, I mean, I think actually that's a really good point. So I think that it is important the kinds of language that we use around this work. So, but I'm hoping that when we do the ethnography, that we'll start to unpick. But I suspect that we'll never have a clear answer. We may be able to look at general trends, global trends over time, perhaps. But this phenomena is actually happening around the world.
But I think you said an interesting point there, over time, and I'm trying to think about, human nature and human reactions to issues of relationships and grief, etc. And is what is happening here, just because it's accessible to people, does it give you an indication of actually human response to episodes of grief over time, or is it just the fact that when you can do it, that it suddenly looks like it's
I think that
as relevant?
I suspect that one thing I haven't mentioned is relationship between these sites and digital media. there's a team in Australia who are looking at the digital memory to do with David Bowie, which is why we're kind of leaving them to do their work and we're doing the material stuff as archaeologists. And of course, people copy, don't they? They copy what other people do. And so it's a bit like how you stop people from dropping litter is you clear away the litter and then that's a sign, don't drop litter. So if people see that there's flowers at these places, they're probably more likely to then leave flowers at these places, particularly if they're fans. So I think that these things do have cycles where they start to accumulate and then they have quiet periods, and then around the anniversaries, or if certain things are in the news, or if somebody sees a social media post, they think, oh yes, I'm going to London, I'll go to Tunstall Road, or but we do see stuff. I'm trying to remember around Amy Winehouse, where people have left messages who say, I am from Spain. I am a huge fan, and I have come. You know, it's clear that they've come to London and they've made a choice to go to Camden, to go to Camden Square Gardens, to leave something at that shrine.
It is a proper pilgrimage, isn't it? So,
Sarah.
Great talk. I was thinking right from the start, and obviously it'll come into it when you go do your ethnographic research, what seemed particularly interesting to me about what you're presenting here is the insight it gives into audiences and different trends in, I mean, I'm using the word audience, which you can interpret really broadly, but trends in how complaints are being made and who is responding to those complaints, or trends in terms of gender of the artists and what kinds of messages are being left or not. But from my own personal research perspective, I guess the thing that I really started to think about is what could you say about these audiences in terms of why they are so passionate about this subject matter, and are there lessons that can be learned from this passion that could be constructively applied to sites of the distant past or heritage that is not so contemporary? Like, I'm interested to know if that passion can be harnessed in ways that could make other aspects of heritage that are less prominent, or maybe we could even understand why the media is engaging, and like you were just saying now, the media is obviously involved in further cultivating more passionate responses. I was just wondering if you think there's insights that can be learned that can be applied to other forms of heritage.
Well, I guess, gosh, that's a really interesting thought and question. And I mean, we presented on this in New Orleans, and one comment we had at the time was about, and I think it was from somebody who was a music fan, is about the fact that, like myself, you kind of grow up with these musicians and they really become a part of your life. And I cried when I heard the news that David Bowie had died. And so I think that for many people like myself, they are just incredibly important figures that you aspire to look up to. So I think there's a very deep kind of emotional connection there to music. And I think particularly for somebody like David Bowie, who always positioned himself as an outsider, that was through his diverse personalities, that was the one thread that ran through. I mean, he was one of the first to symbolise a kind of a homoerotic relationship on stage. When he threw his arm around Mick Ronson's shoulder, which caused a big stir. And, he went through periods of kind of proclaiming himself bisexual, kind of fluid gender. So I know that he's very important for people from the LGBTQI communities. But in terms of the distant past, I mean, I think there's still, the interesting thing about music is because it's recorded, you can still play Amy Winehouse, you can still play David Bowie. If these sorts of things are going to survive, this kind of activity and connection, it's going to be through music, isn't it? I guess. And so it kind of requires the next generation to start listening and become interested in that artist's music. People still go and seek out Joshua Tree and sites in America and go on pilgrimages. Still go to the grave markers of Robert Johnson. So they're connecting through the music. And one interesting thing I saw recently is that they're starting to use hologram technology to bring these artists back onto the stage, which I find a little bit creepy. You're looking at me as if to say.
No, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I've seen it myself.
Yeah. So again, I mean, you could theoretically go and see Amy Winehouse perform on stage again in front of a live orchestra. So I guess, in answer to your question, that was really long-winded, is how can you make it living for people, even though it's dead?
I mean, yeah, I guess it is. I wasn't quite sure how you would take the answer to that because I don't know that there is an answer. But I feel like in some ways it's what you suggested is that it's all of these intangible elements, the music, the person, their complicated histories, that are the things that are really what people are passionate about. It's not necessarily the site. So it was more about how can you, the typical mentality in archaeology in general is that the focus is on the site, even though arguably the site is irrelevant in many ways. It's all of these intangible elements. So I was just wondering if you think, or maybe as you're going forward with future research, if aspects of what you're pulling from this, which is just so much insight into audience behaviors around these sites, that can be meaningfully applied in other archaeological or heritage contexts.
I think I'll let Paul answer that question.
Well, in the case of David Bowie, of course, there is no burial site.
Yeah.
So looking forward into the future, I mean, that thinking of historical figures in the music world, famous composers and so on from the last 300 or 400 years. Presumably, for most of those, there's a grave site. So if you wanted to do a pilgrimage, you could go to the grave of a famous composer or something.
Beethoven and stuff like that.
Yeah, but with with Bowie, looking forward into the future, Jim Morrison has a grave, and Graceland will always be there, and so forth, I guess. But with Bowie, there is no grave, so these pop-up memorials almost become not significant.
He curated his own death, of course, with Black Stars.
Indeed,
so
yes.
He would have known that this kind of activity was likely. Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting thing. Yeah. He amassed a vast archive, over 70,000 objects, which went into the V&A exhibition. So he was archiving his own life, but I think that the way he organised his death was to actually prevent any kind of pilgrim activity.
There are non-musical analogues, aren't there, which aren't about contemporary figures. I'm thinking Crossbones Graveyard, in Southwark, which is a late medieval graveyard, which is reputed to be where prostitutes of the 15th, 16th century were buried. That's now a site of pilgrimage with lots of. It's just a car park with railings, but you go there, and women from all over Britain and the world can festoon the railing with memorials to the life of women and murdered prostitutes. And it's become a spontaneous site of memorialisation to women. It's not about musicians, it's not about contemporary people in that graveyard. But there's a link to a resonant past and the present. And it's that, isn't it? That's that resonant link.
Yeah. And of course, the people who visit these sites are at liberty to choose their object, to take that object, or to take their pen, their marker pen. And there is a certain, people say these spontaneous shrines are a form of democratic collective action. And that's quite different, isn't it, to your National Trust sites or your... but ultimately, is it about these places are they're replacements, aren't they, in a sense, for the grave, but they're also places at which people can project the cult of personality of their idol onto these sites. So maybe that's the other thing, that if we can convince people to have some kind of the new age of public archaeology is all going to be about cult cults and idolatry. Yeah. Mm.
How will you get to talk to the people who've left all this stuff? How can you actually find the people?
I think
behind
we can
this?
get to them through things like fan groups
Yeah.
for a start. I mean, at Bromley, it's going to be fairly straightforward because we're already in contact with both the heritage team and also the team that managed the bandstand. And so we will probably be able to put out feelers into that community. That would be more straightforward. I think at Tunstall Road, we're just going to have to go down and have our consent forms prepared and just ask
Lurk and
people
wait.
permission, lurk and wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think we'll also, we'll try to talk to maulers and we'll talk to the. We've already been having the email exchanges with BT, for example, about the phone box and the Crown Estate and all kinds of people. But I think that that's going to be the next step. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Will you also be talking to the neighbours who want all this stuff removed?
Well, if they'll talk to us, I mean, yeah.
That's an interesting set of attitudes in itself, isn't it? The anti-attitude.
Well, if that's true.
Yeah.
It might be, yeah. I mean, I was thinking about that as well, and maybe do a residents' association or something like that. You might only have to have one conversation with the
There
person
may
who
be
chairs the
minutes.
residents'
Yeah.
association, and maybe there would be minutes or something like that from a residents' association meeting that you might be able
That's
to
true.
get access to. So there may be a way of doing that, but I would have thought that would be really interesting if it was possible.
Yeah. I mean, I presume that at George's Garden, that the people who were in overall chucks, it was clearly being managed, that park. And so I think we'll be able to get in touch with them and through them probably connect to other gardeners in the park. I doubt whether we'll be able to talk to Mary Austin. I think she, we have to respect people's rights to be left alone as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Queen as well, actually, because I'm just wondering whether this is quite a good opportunity with Queen, because obviously just had the film and everyone's talking about Queen all of a sudden, and I mean they never went away, obviously, but they're much more in the public consciousness again now as a result of that movie. And I just wonder whether there's any increase in activity around the house, for example, since the movie came out, for instance. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe
Yeah,
last month,
I mean, I
but
haven't been. The last time I visited was.
it's almost like triggers, isn't it? A little trigger that sets things
exactly.
off, and it's either I don't know if there is a big movie planned about David Bowie, but if there was, then you would expect the whole activity to start all over again.
They've done stuff on Carnaby Street. They've had the lyrics of the songs put up in signs on Carnaby Street.
Oh,
They have
right.
like a pop-up museum around there as well.
Oh.
I think they're more focused on the living aspect rather than necessarily remembering his death. I think they're trying to really focus it on being alive and happy.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll add that one to my database. Thank you. Yeah. No, I think you're right.
Yes.
I was going to ask a little bit about kind of how the emergence of etiquette at these sites, especially you mentioned the site, interested in what you found from observation or from what you've heard about how do rules about appropriateness in these sites get defined? Is it emergent? Is it dictated? Some combination? What have you found is appropriate? Is anything too far?
Well, I mean, clearly when you get signs going up, that's a sign that somebody wants people to do one thing and not another. Don't graffiti David Bowie's face, please. I mean, I haven't seen anybody. I mean, I've been at sites when people have come and laid flowers, and I've seen lots of people stop and take photographs. There's been that moment of recognition where people are just going about their daily lives, and then they just happen to realise what they're looking at, and they stop and they photograph it. I am pretty sure that things are being taken, but I don't call it stealing, because I mean, if you look at English property law, it's abandonment anyway, isn't it? So if you leave something in a public place and you're abandoning that, so you're abandoning your property rights. I guess at George's garden, because of the low picket fencing, it was quite clear that they were sending out the message, this is my garden and that's yours. And there were, yeah, but I mean, apart from that, I can't really comment. I haven't seen anything that's really stuck out in my mind as being a little bit odd or awful. I think most people take photographs. I think people go, they read. A lot of people read the graffiti and they'll read the messages, but I don't see people picking stuff up. I think people are generally fairly respectful, but once it's actually placed, they kind of leave it alone. But they will say walk along the wall at Tunstall Road and they will read. They will spend quite a lot of time reading messages, or they will stoop down and read the message on the card. But there are clearly places where somebody, so for example, the photograph of Heading Street at the beginning, if I can zoom back to it. I mean, somebody's been along with the broom and has pushed the sides of the material in. It's probably restaurant owners. I think actually they'll be an interesting group to speak to. But I don't really think I can answer it. I mean, I think we need to do ethnography again to answer that properly.
What you're seeing there is a kind of formalisation. This process, initially you get this chaos. And actually quite a lot of it is, at the beginning, mass hysteria. I mean, it certainly was with Princess Diana. It wasn't just fans, it was a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
People went and cried and put flowers down. But over time, you see this formalisation. I find it interesting that in some sites, like George Michael's example, that's stopped in its tracks, the formalisation process. So as an archaeologist, there would be nothing left to see. You wouldn't even know that there was something there. But Marc Bolan, obviously, it's suitably far enough from anyone's houses that the formalisation process has gone on and on to actually leave a permanent marker.
Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting. I mean, I suspect that the people who were gardening at the park were trying to keep it tidy to placate the neighbours, because it's such a posh area.
But if that had just been left, I mean, if they hadn't have complained, it'd be interesting to know what that would look like, because over time it would morph and change, and then you know, would you actually get little stone-built walls and the gardens kept, and then would it become the memorial park? And you know, we'll never know, because that's just been. But you know, in prehistory we see it. You know, out of chaos you get formalisation developing. And generally, all we see is that end result.
From fluidity becomes rigidity.
It becomes rigidity, exactly. Yeah, the movement has gone.
I wonder if there's a correlation between that process and the attitude towards that garden, and also the attitude of the neighbours to George Michael when he was alive. I mean, was he a good neighbour, someone that they liked having as a neighbour, or was he just trouble all the way through because of the attention he drew to them?
He used to live down the road from where I used to live, in Goring. I mean, his London house was not his permanent address.
Okay.
And the Goring was where he and he would quite regularly drink in the pub. I wouldn't have recognised him. He didn't look anything like the image of him like my mum. But I mean, that became this memorial.
Yeah, that is still, I think,
and I think there
was
was
memorial side.
Interesting to see the sort of, we never will now because they're both gone, but the difference between the memorial in Goring, which was more of a lost local, compared to the memorial in London, which is the image.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that really, really fascinating as well. I mean, the Marc Bolan, if you want to visit one of them, I would actually recommend you visit the Marc Bolan shrine, because it's an archaeological dream, because it has been in existence for some 40 years. And if you actually, the history of the site is on the TAG website, and they literally detail it year by year. They've got a great historical record, and you can see the consecutive, you know, you can see the sequencing of the site and how it's actually built up, and you can understand why it now looks the way it looks.
Which is not the way it's going to look in 40 years' time, I suspect. It will evolve and change.
No, but you mentioned that it's actually really close to some houses.
Is it?
So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't clear from the photograph, but where is it? So this is actually the road. So if you imagine the car was travelling this direction and then hit the barrier that was a fence that was there and then the tree. Well, here there's like a dirt kind of track, and then there's a row of houses, sort of here-ish. And whenever I've been here, there's been other people visiting the site. I mean, it's about a 6-minute walk from the train station. But it's not on your it's not your Tunstall Road, it's not your Haddon Street, it's not on your normal kind of tourist beat. And when I've been here, actually, I got talking to a guy from the Netherlands who was cycling past, and he saw me taking photographs, and he said, well, you know, I cycle past this place, and I'm like, what is it? And I said, oh, he's an English musician who died in the 1970s. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. So, yeah. But no, I mean, it's not in 40 years' time. I mean, it also depends on the tag group and, you know, their ability to keep going. And that they're going to get older, and then they need to pass on the torch to the next generation.
Into the local government.
Yeah.
And then it becomes something a bit different.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'd probably better start to wind up. I'm just remembering now that we actually started half an hour earlier than we normally do.